Welcome to the world-changing podcast.
Was that too much? Yeah, that was probably too much. But let's keep it. We'll keep it anyway. How about this? If we do the podcast and the world doesn't change, then we can take that out. Welcome to the world-changing podcast, where we deconstruct the projects and products that are moving us towards a decentralized and carbon-free future. We'll talk to the skeptics, supporters, and innovators in the fields that depend on electricity to run their industries, which is changing every single day. I'm your host, Greg Robinson, co-founder of Aston Labs, a decentralized infrastructure company. And on the other side of the camera here, we have Flo Lumsden, our producer, and she will make sure that the train stays on the tracks while we do this. So Ed and I have known each other for 15 years. Ed and I started playing in a band while I was in college. We've written hundreds of songs together. And while we were playing in the band, writing hundreds of songs together, and that was sort of a large focus of my life. Ed, meanwhile, was writing foundational software for airline mobile apps. Ed sold his first software to SoftDisk when he was 15 years old. And he went to Cornell. When he graduated from Cornell, he did his tour at Microsoft and Google, writing foundational software for the internet. Ed's our first podcast guest for a lot of reasons. Some of it our history. We've started two companies together, but also because this conversation that we have, we go from exploring the weight of online identities, aka why Ed doesn't really want to do this podcast. We talk about how Ed discovered code at a very young age, and also why we started Aston Labs. Enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with my co-founder and BFF, Ed McKenzie.
So tell me things.
Yeah. So isn't that so funny? It's like as soon as you hit the recording, and then there's like the pressure for it to be. Actually, I read a blog post about this the other day. It's probably like Seth Godin's blog or something, which I think is like quantum entangled with my brain. It was something about like making something big or making something great, like by default is just not going to be great. It's like the pressure of making something great actually makes you fail at it.
It reminds me actually of this. I watched this. I haven't seen it in forever. There was an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation where they're in some kind of like time loop, and there's this weird like space-time hole where this ship from 80 years ago is emerging from the wormhole, and it's on a collision course with the Enterprise, and they try to avoid it, and they collide. Commercial break. It starts over again. Wormhole. Ship comes out, they try something different, they collide. And again, I'm forgetting the detail, but it turns out that the solution is they've got to do the thing that they don't want to do, which is go through the wormhole, and that solves it's the perfect, like,
yeah, the obstacle is the way, as they say.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I was thinking about this. This podcast is not about Stoic philosophy.
Anything.
Here we are. It's about everything and nothing. But I was thinking about this whole idea of being reluctant to anchor something on the internet. Here we are. We spend most of our days in crypto and blockchain and these sort of immutable ledgers, and we're like, oh, this is so cool. You can do something and it's there forever. And then meanwhile, you're like, we're thinking about, okay, well, let's record us talking about things that we think today, and like that becomes immutable on the internet, and we're like, oh, that sounds terrible. So like live in this dichotomy of like, we want all content to be like immutable, but then we also want it to be like not.
My issue with, I forget who wrote this a while ago, that the issue with Facebook is that in real life, we have multiple identities. I have my identity when I'm talking to you. I have my identity when I'm talking to my parents or my friends or whoever. So we have these multiple disparate identities that they overlap, but they're different people. And this was around the time Facebook was forcing everybody into real names, and your identity here is like you have one identity that's everywhere. And it's a natural thing to want to have different identities. I talk to you about different things. I talk to my parents about, and vice versa. And it's weird to be forced into having one identity everywhere. There's value in having your transactions frozen forever on the blockchain so you can verify them and look back on them and be able to prove things happen. But it feels different for human interactions.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, there always is that feeling of, I mean, there also is this really important transition that I feel like we're all having to go through as a society now that like information, whether true, false, or inconclusive, is completely widespread. But it's like we need a new set of understanding or a new set of sayings that, like, maybe it's okay to say something today that in a week from now you get a new piece of information, and then you modify your thinking, and whatever you said at the timestamp 7 days ago is like overwritten in some way, but it's not, because it's still there. And if someone only sees your 7 day ago identity, then your new current mode of operation cannot be, you can't be judged on who you are today. You're sort of being judged by who you are in the past. And I think that's an interesting dilemma of immutability in that sense. Like, this is not a new concept, right? Like, this is not.
It's like we need a cultural shift, though, because if you're a kid growing up today and you do stupid stuff on the internet at, I don't know, age 11, 10 years from now, when you're, or even before that, if you're applying to colleges or you're applying for a job, or I feel like I'm fortunate to have come up with the internet, but early enough that I was before the kind of permanent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
don't. How do you redeem people who were growing up and making mistakes? And
yeah. Can we just like check the timestamp? Like, the timestamp will set you free or something.
Yeah.
What was the date on this recording? Right. That is, I agree. Open solicitation to anyone who listens to this. Figure that out. Like,
We'll change the world.
Yeah, you will change the world. What are the rules that we need for, if we are going to have immutability? I mean, once upon a time, you and I played in a band and we recorded music together, and we went through the process of having to go to the publishing, through all of the details of making sure that if this got played somewhere, then we got our royalties, maybe made like $1 or something like that.
Oh, 25, I think. Yeah.
About 25. And there's reasons to have that, like online art, like art being able to be timestamped and then logged as who is the creator. I've seen podcasts where people will edit the audio to make it sound like the two people's voices said something completely different than what was said. And it's basically like indistinguishable from they actually said it. And so there's got to be some way to take that content and sort of like log it on a chain that says this is from this creator, it was signed by this creator, and only if that file sort of can be traced back to this original point, is it authentic? Is it the actual recording?
Well, I don't know what the solution to that is, but we need to figure it out quickly, because I don't know if you've been following. So there's Stable Diffusion, which lets you turn these props into pictures. And then Google had a crazy demo the other week where they can do the same thing, but for video. You can turn these, people haven't seen this, they should. Basically, you can create these realistic looking videos out of English text. You type in a prompt, cat chasing a ball of yarn, and the AI will create this video that's super realistic looking of a cat chasing a ball of yarn. And the evil supervillain part of my brain goes to, can you imagine the kind of power that would give somebody who was trying to create a video for an October surprise during a election campaign. Just the if you create a video of your opponent saying something just horrific that looked realistic, and how do you even disprove it?
And the only way I can find out if it's valid is if I could trace it back and say, like, this came from this particular creator. And then it's up to the product builders to then figure out how to make that easily digestible, to write a, to sort of market as, hey, this came from this is authenticated or something. It can't be like, oh, do you want to travel back through this chain of 40-digit numbers and find out who this came from and then cross-reference this other person? Like, it's got to be easy. But
what you're pointing to is it takes a lot of work to do the research and figure out if things are real or not. And
who has time for that?
Would be a full-time job if you did that all the time, which is why we have trusted authorities, which depend on trust. Like, if you can't trust your news media or your friends or whoever.
Yeah. So immutability is more challenging than just saying, oh, it's really great that everything is sort of logged. I mean, we already know this. So, like, building a product is very different than building, a
society,
technology or something like that. Yeah. So, you need society to adopt here. I mean, that's a thought. I think that going from this concept of immutability into the idea of decentralization, this idea of trusted third parties versus, let's say, centralized trusted parties. So if you use a credit card, you get hacked and you lose a bunch of money or something like that off your card, there's some recourse there to like go and reverse that charge because you have this trusted third party who's letting you do that. And I spend most of our days thinking about decentralization of physical stuff, physical power infrastructure and other things, to create resilience, to create things that will endure, and just sort of redesign the power grid in a way that might allow it to last another 100 years and potentially support some of these crazy ideas we have around digital money and AI and, electric vehicles and all these things that are going to require a whole bunch of that. But
well, I think
there's an interesting thing about centralization and versus trusted third parties. So
yes, definitely. I think kind of two problems overlap. One is the technical problem of how do you create this record that is not tamperable. We know how to do that. We can make immutable records that we can prove to be authentic using all the things we know how to do in that realm. The harder part is trust. Whatever agent is creating those records, how do you? It's almost the key problem of decentralization. How do you trust that the agent who creates those immutable records is somebody you actually trust? I can create a immutable record that you owe me $1 billion, but like, do you trust that record?
Right.
It's easier to solve that if it's just me and you. Like, you trust me, you're putting your financial life in my hands by trusting me to create this record. But how do you do that for somebody you've never met? And
right. That's a good point. It's like the common enemy in the crypto community has become this like trusted third party, but it's like now you're talking about the issue of the trusted first party. It's like the person I'm actually making this deal with directly, I still have to trust that person.
Yeah.
Or do I? That is ultimate conundrum of decentralization is if I go to you and say, I want to borrow some money from you, and you say, well, what are you going to give me if you don't pay me back? And I say, I'm going to give you this token that I made. It's like, well, how'd you make it? It's like, here, I'll show you how I made it. So I send you the code, and then you're like, well, I don't read code. It's like, that's okay, but I showed you, so I'm going to do this deal. So it is really like, it's really cool. I guess the reason I'm diving so deep on this is like, it's fascinating to me how many products need to get built for this to actually come to fruition, because these are like real real world challenges of we've imagined so many scenarios that could be sort of disrupted by blockchain, crypto, all of that. But it's like, well, what is the product? Because whatever that front end ends up becoming, it can't just be like, oh, you can do anything you want. Do it. Take it. You take it yourself and you go figure it out. And then to your point, let's say you do go figure it out. Do you trust that person who went and figured that out? And when they did it, did everyone abide by the altruistic nature of decentralization, which is everything's supposed to be transparent and immutable? And sounds like we have more questions than answers at this point. But
it's like we're at this point where we've, I don't know, just maybe not a great analogy, but blockchain is like the internet. Like we've invented the internet. It's this amazing tool that can do all these things, but it's not the complete solution to the problem. You need other stuff on top of it. There's reasons why the AOLs and Facebooks of the world become dominant, because it's the sort of the vessel that delivers the internet to people who aren't willing to buy the internet kit and follow the 350 steps to put it together. And I think blockchain is in a similar place where the technology is there and the technology works, but there's a gap between sort of having the box of Legos and sort of the product that anybody can use. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the big pieces that's missing is, again, trust. Like, how do we, when you compare it to fiat currency, like your example earlier, even companies who are deep into crypto, in theory, know how this stuff works. They get hacked to the tune of 6, 7, 8 figures worth of money, because, if you have a bank involved, you can go spend money on your credit card knowing that if something bad happens, the bank's got your back. Where with crypto, there's missing pieces there. And a fully functional financial system based on blockchain has some pieces that haven't been built. And I think whoever figures that out is going to be sitting pretty and will have changed the world. But those pieces aren't there yet.
Yeah. Open invitation for everyone to get involved in this. I mean, this really is like the hope. To me, there's so many things that are hopeful amidst many conversations I have where people will ask, are you concerned about, there's just these blanket questions like, are you concerned about AI? It's like, you just brought up this point of like, well, the concern about AI is not necessarily my concern about AI. I just know I have to sort of have like a pretty strong bullshit filter, and that filter needs to get stronger and stronger and stronger over time until someone makes a crypto version of a bullshit filter, like an authenticated BS detector for every single person on Earth. Like, until someone makes that the universal BS detector, is that what it would be called?
I mean, my brain is turning on without. Yeah, go ahead.
We're gonna interrupt this program to go and whiteboard that.
We should invite Greg Adams on this, by the way, because he's thinking about this stuff for internet misinformation.
We actually know somebody who's working on the universal BS detector.
I don't know if
I'm not going to brand it that
I wouldn't say universal, but yes, Greg is working on tools around how to tackle misinformation on the internet, because the incentives are lined up such that CNN or whoever, or even the incentives are lined up in a way where the truth value of the news being presented is not what it needs to be. And how do we as news consumers look at a story and figure out, is this true or not? It's like trust is the defining problem of the 21st century. It's like we've taken all of us and put us all in the same room, the entire world, we're all in one room. And a lot of the social patterns and behaviors that work really well when you are just in your house, your neighborhood, your town, they break down when we're all in the same room and we're all able to speak to everybody at once. And it cuts across news and finance and everything. But
it doesn't scale well.
No.
Yeah.
what's the number? Dunbar's number? It's
150, I think.
yeah, it's like the 150 is the largest number of people you can have in a group before you can't trust everybody in the group.
Yeah. Or you can't
And
know him or something like that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. That so many things to design and build. I think about that with my kids. Like, what skills are they going to have? What do you think? So when you were, I mean, maybe it wasn't this much foresight, but like if you could go back to being a kid and think about like, what did your parents give you? What access did your parents give you in terms of technology or experiences
mm,
or something like that you think like prepared you for now? Because I mean, what we're doing now is completely different than anything you and I would have. I mean, we've known each other for like 15
15 years.
years. What do you think if you went back and said this early exposure to something has sort of prepared you for this moment now, even though there's no way you could have predicted that it was headed this way? It's just like,
Yeah. One thing I've thought about a lot, maybe this doesn't directly answer the question. One thing I've thought about a lot is how fortunate I was to have grown up in a time when computers were just starting to be a thing. And, obviously I was really fortunate that I had a dad who was into computers and had computers around the house, but that had to dovetail with the particular computers that I did have. I grew up on first the Commodore 64, then the early IBM PCs. And I think that was really formative in the sense that those machines were so simple that an 8, 9, 10-year-old kid could like get in there and get his hands dirty and start figuring out, if I do this, then this happens. It gave me the perspective that a computer is just a machine. The software I get from Microsoft or whoever, it's just software. I mean, they have more money and more people working on it than I do, but they're just doing a bigger version of what I can do by getting into it. And I think today's computers are very different. They're essentially appliances, right? You can buy a iPhone and sure, you can go download Xcode and start programming. But the bar is much higher for writing software on an iPhone than it was for changing the colors on the screen on a Commodore 64 or printing, typing, making little text games, whatever. And to Apple's credit, they came out with Swift playgrounds, which are kind of supposed to recreate some of that earlier openness. But I think a difference is that back then, if you wanted to use computers at all, you kind of had to learn this stuff. If you wanted to play a game, you had to stick the floppy in and load star, comma 8, comma 1. I still know this stuff like 30 years later, but you had to know how to list the contents of a disk. You had to know how to load the program you wanted, and like you were basically forced to become a programmer to use this machine at all. One of my formative experiences was learning that if on the Commodore, if you wrote a program and you were running it in Commodore Basic, you could hit it was like you could hit command or control break and it would break into your program. So, or you'd interrupt your program. One day I was playing this one game, I think it was called Siren City. Basically, it was this game where you were a cop car and you were supposed to drive around town dealing with cop things. But one day I hit run stop break in that game and I saw the prompt come up and I was like, whoa, I can list the contents, the program listing and see how this game was made. And I think it must have been like 9 at that point, but it just sort of blew my mind that I wouldn't have gotten to that point had I not been forced to do this stuff to play any games at all. Where today, you get an iPhone, you go to the App Store, you download your games, and well, first off, you can't hit right stop break to break into a game, but just the vehicle that delivers the software to us today is much more appliance-like. That even though you can write software for it, you pretty much won't even ask that question or wonder about it because just it's so easy to just use it as an appliance, and you never even know that you could program it if you weren't sent in that direction by some other idea. So
yeah.
it's a very different world. I guess to answer your question, it feels like big thing that made a huge difference for me was coming up in an era where to use computers at all, you had to be exposed to the wires hanging out in a way that, if you were a curious kid like I was, you wanted to know, well, what is this weird stuff I have to type in to play games? What if I change this? What if I do this? And obviously there's still kids who are playing with computers and becoming software engineers, but I do wonder, would I have ended up where I am now had I not had sort of, maybe I would have wound up being an engineer anyway, but I do wonder. The vehicle is very different now. It's much like, even among practicing engineers today, there's so many layers of abstraction that people just build things without really understanding how they work and how do you make things that are reliable and fast. You just sort of take things off the shelf and stack them together, and it kind of works. So you ship it.
And you hope that everything inside of those boxes that you stacked was built in a sound way that has holes in your security or something like that. Yeah.
And then there's a new update next week and it breaks everything and you don't understand how any of it works. So good luck.
Yeah. It almost seems like there's like that's what drew me in to blockchain, was like, I was able to see this thing that was getting huge. I mean, like, cause we first started talking about this in, gosh, it was like 2011, 2012 or something like that. I mean, it was pretty early. Like, I think it's easy to look at like when the Bitcoin white paper came out and be like, oh, that's when people were paying attention. No, they weren't.
They were not.
No one is paying it. I mean, 2011 for sure. I met other people who say like, oh, I started sort of paying attention then. We won't necessarily talk about what financial actions I and many other people I know wish they took in 2011. Some people did, but I just
say, sidebar there. Someone, I can't remember if it was on Reddit, someone was talking about how they wished they bought Bitcoin super early, and their reply was, well, the thing is, if you had, back in those days, you probably had your own like off-chain wallet on your own machine. And the number of stories of people who had some Bitcoin back then and lost their key and will never recover their millions of dollars of Bitcoin. Like,
yeah.
Who's to say you would have managed to keep that anyway?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, maybe I did, and I didn't even know. Like, I didn't grow up that way. My exposure to computers early on was like very much a social thing. It wasn't a personal thing. It was very much AOL Instant Messenger was coming around. And so it was a way to, I guess, like what you said earlier, it's a way to bring school home with me and make school never stop. I could just be with my friends all night long. And then weird strangers who would ask you weird questions, and then you would lie to them.
ASL?
Yeah. Exactly. Man, crazy times. So like that was my exposure. And I just remember there were sort of two times where over the years I was like, oh, I get how this stuff works. One was like when you would dig into, I mean, just like even having to like correctly type in like a file path or something like that was like, what? Like that's a thing many people like wouldn't even think of nowadays. Now it's just, again, this gets into that idea of the interface. The products you build are actually the products that get built are actually truly what changes the world or makes the progress. It's not just like the existence of the technology. It's the people who come along and devote their life to making it accessible that I think is been most fascinating. And then when we, like, I can't stress enough how little I knew at the time about code or really the depths of computers. So I would have been one of those people on the outside being like, oh, this is a cool game. Like, I'll just play that. It's colors and everything. Like, I wouldn't have thought, oh, like, how do these wires connect inside? I think I thought about like the physical wires connecting inside, but it was never like, how does the software then turn this into this experience? And if I thought about it, I'd be like, God, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to look into that. I remember when I first downloaded any kind of code on my computer that was like a Bitcoin wallet. And I was trying to like learn how to, you know, I was going to mine Bitcoin on my own machine, you know, because I was like, oh, I heard about this thing. And I just remember how incredibly challenging it was for me, like not being a software engineer. And I think at that point, when I did that with Bitcoin, I was like, wow, this is both hard, but also incredibly accessible in the sense that like a lot of people can start working on this. I think that was the seed for me of crypto and blockchain, was like, people can now start working on this because they can see the wires. They can go to, and make, that goes back to what you were saying, is like those wires hanging out of the Commodore 64 that you could sort of say, by the way, these are metaphoric wires, not physical wires. But
So the worst were those two.
Yeah. Don't cut the red one. So, yeah. So like being able to see that and like dig into it and be like, okay, here's what I'm using. I know why I'm using it. And I can also see the code. And so now I can go and reference that and say, and that made me pretty hopeful. Like even to the point that like my kids who are all 10 and under, I'm trying to like seed them with these concepts, because I really like, as they adopt things, I want them to realize it's like, you can actually go grab the source code of, that's an interesting.
Yeah.
So here's one
I
question.
think open source has been huge in that. I mean, open source has been huge.
This program that you were using to potentially pay someone all the way around the world or do some kind of interaction on the internet with someone around the world, and you can actually go audit to see what that looks like. And I think that it's almost like the renaissance of the people who grew up with the Commodore 64, because like you actually know how to then go take this source code and then like decode it in some way, even though it's already built. You're not just coming to this abstracted layer of user interface that's really amazing, and it's made the iPhone very easy to adopt.
It's funny, you know, I had that experience with growing up dissecting how Commodore 64s work. And then I went from there into the IBM PC realm, you know, Microsoft and IBM. And the Commodore wasn't open source, but it was sort of a simple enough machine that you could sort of figure out how it worked.
You could crack it open.
Yeah. Where Microsoft stuff was completely closed source. And you sort of paid them money, they gave you a black box and good luck. And if it didn't do what you wanted to do, then you're out of luck. And then open source was kind of a, you know, I was that kid who ran Linux all through college because, you know, I was just done with Windows 98. And open source was huge in the sense that it was, I thought, it was better software for what I was trying to do, but it's also interesting as a social movement where suddenly it's like the entire world working on this thing, whatever it is. It may or may not be actually quote unquote better than whatever Microsoft is shipping, but just the fact that I can make it do what I want it to do. And, you know, if there's, I remember the first time I was running, I think I was running Red Hat Linux at that point. And there was some bug in the desktop environment, GNOME, and the light bulb sort of went off my head. I could go in there and fix this bug in my desktop. Like, you can't do that with Windows. You just sort of have to wait 3 years for the next version of Windows. And yeah, I think that's been a really interesting thing about blockchain. You know, it was born in open source, and no one would take a blockchain seriously if it wasn't open source. For the most part, you're not going to go in and change the code, but just knowing that the code is there and that you can go audit that code, it creates some of that trust we were talking about earlier. You know, just the idea that you can go see what the Ethereum code is or the Solana code is doing behind the scenes, even though you don't necessarily trust the authors in the way that you would trust your friends, your neighbors. At least the trust would be much less if they sort of hand you this black box and said, this is a blockchain that's going to do these things, put your money into it. Good luck.
Yeah. It would sort of be like being handed an Encyclopedia Britannica and being told every single word in this is 100% true.
Exactly.
Okay, I'll take it. Yeah, without cited sources or any of those things.
Right.
Um,
And if there's a typo, you gotta wait till next year when they fix it.
right.
They fix it.
Exactly. Yeah, you got to buy the next version. You got to buy the
Yes.
updated version of them. Yeah, I think so. On the other side of not software, obviously, you spend all your time there, but we've been working together on. Well, we started working together on music, but then we started working on energy related things. And one of the things I'm often thinking about is not like, oh, interesting, this decentralized nature of software and how you could, I do often think about like decentralizing certain jobs. Let's just take infrastructure as an example, or utility infrastructure, just the built environment, like the built environment, whether it's any kind of commercial building or power plant or, a water utility or any of those things. It's like, ultimately you have a few jobs that you have that have to be, a few things have to be checked off the list. And it's always been more or less the same. Like if you were going to, in the late 1800s, if you wanted to go and build, a power station, let's say at like Pearl Street, for instance, and if your name was Edison and you had a buddy named John Pierpont and you were like, oh, I'm going to go build this. It's like, well, first thing you got to do is you got to discover that opportunity is there. And then you got to figure out, you kind of have to underwrite it in some way, whatever that means. It could be, oh, we have the necessary permits. Maybe there was no permits. It's okay. We're in the window of permitting. And then they have to cite it. They got to figure out who's going to pay for the thing that it makes. And then they got to get the money. Good. You had a buddy to give them the money. So that's like the ultimate sort of like peer-to-peer decentralized electricity system, right? Like it's like, okay, I got this system. The creator of the discoverer and the underwriting of the system, Edison, that is me. I'm Edison in this analogy here.
I'm Pierpont.
Right. And so we go in and we say, okay, well, we found a place for it. We discovered where it should go. I've figured out how to underwrite the technology and underwrite like how it's going to get hooked up and sort of designed what the network might look like. And we found who's going to buy the power. We're going to power some light bulbs and people are going to have electric lights. It's going to be amazing. So I come to you and I say, and you're like, well, who's going to manage it? Are those off takers actually like, are they actually going to pay you? Because if they don't pay you, you don't get your money back. And so
off takers being basically people who are going to buy the power.
People are going to buy the service from this power station. Yeah. Buy the power lights, and they're going to pay. So that's the underwriting phase. And then you say, okay, it's underwritten. I trust this underwriting. And the way you trust me to underwrite this, John, trust me, Tom, to underwrite the system, is then you put in the money and then we can build it and then we manage it. And then we have to manage it to make sure that it keeps making money. That has not changed. Like the way they build a solar power plant today, somebody goes out, call him Tom. Tom goes out and then says, I found a place where I think solar is going to really work, and goes to the landowner. We're going to have to introduce some more people into this situation here. But like there's somebody there, call it Carol. Carol owns the land. Tom comes up, says, I've discovered this thing. I'm not going to underwrite this project. I find somebody who will buy the electricity from it, who's trustworthy or bankable enough to actually pay their power bills. And then the system is now been underwritten in some way. Then they go to their version of John Pierpont, which really is probably like a bank called JP Morgan or something like that. And they get their money and then somebody manages it. And so like none of that is really changed over the years.
Hold on. Isn't the P in JP Morgan Pierpont?
Right. It's you. Right,
go on.
Right. Yeah. So, but now it's a big entity. Now you have become this big giant entity that now has its own way of doing things. You're now this centralized entity they have to go to. And the details have changed, like the way you discover the permitting process is different. There's now tax incentives for building in certain places, but let's just put them all under the headings of we found a place for something to go. We made sure that it was like, could be fun.
You're scoping out on Google Maps instead of riding around on a horse.
Right. The technology has changed, but the process hasn't really changed that much. It's like you still have to do those things. And so what what we thought about as we were thinking about like starting Aston Labs was like, well, I think you could apply a lot of this blockchain technology to these same things that have been going on forever. I mean, basically at the end of the day, you need yourself like somebody who can underwrite the actual system and manage the actual power plant or utilities, and you need somebody to finance it. Now, that sounds simple, but that is what slows us down. Who's financing it is a game changer. Like or I should say, if someone with a different view on what the world should look like and what the underwriting process should look like and what the management should look like, that really is ultimately what changes what the power grid looks like, or what it looks like for people to have clean water, or what it looks like. Like, you got to change the money, and you got to change the source of the money, or you have to at least change like what the people putting the money in believe. And so that idea of, and again, those jobs aren't going to really change. You got to find a place for a power plant to go, for some solar panels to go, or a windmill to go. And then you need to underwrite the financing. You have to make sure that it's like bankable and someone's going to actually pay the power bills when it gets made, or the cost is going to be shared in some way. And then someone has to like make sure that it continues to run and improve. And the windmill, if the blade falls off the windmill, somebody's got to like put a new one on there. And so, but that's always been the same. And then the financing comes in, but now it's just become this situation where everything is so centralized. And so now you have these like controllers of what the future looks like, while people are protesting about this new future they would like. And meanwhile, these people who are tasked with actually financing all of it are like, we're good.
They are making plenty of money doing what they're doing, and they're at the center of the hub and spoke. So good luck to you all.
Right. And so the early conversations we were having before we sort of landed on the idea of starting Aston Labs was, what if you could decentralize all of those tasks? What if you could get back to the pure sense of like, okay, well, there's this financier and they trust the underwriting. Do you need this gigantic, like, centralized tower of people to do the underwriting if you have decentralized participation, or you kind of had incentivized participation, or better yet, can the underwriter, I mean, back in the days of John Pierpont and Thomas Edison, like, they were both going to gain in the growth of that. And that's what I think is, we didn't really touch on that part of blockchain technology, but this idea of it being open source, the software aspect is interesting, but also this concept of like, you, the person who discovers a bug and says, I can change that myself. It's like, well, imagine being able to be compensated in some way for working on that after work, or just some other time. Like being able to, I mean, it was nice of you to fix like, even if Microsoft had opened it up and said, oh, we're going to let you fix bugs, it's like, I'm pretty sure you would have been throwing some like 1985 Microsoft stock to fix that bug for them.
Well, worse than that, there's the missing piece there would have been unified fix the bug. How would Microsoft have known to trust me to fix it? What's the distribution for the fix? Where in blockchain is more of a sort of more direct, I'm providing the service for the network, therefore I'm getting paid by the network. And yeah, yeah. I think
You interrupt this program to think about that.
yeah, there's definitely some interesting. It's simple and makes sense on the blockchain, but bridging that into reality is blockchain's in reality, but bridging that into sort of the realm of physical infrastructure is the interesting problem. Like, how do you sort of
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
communicate to people that, hey, if you solve this problem, there's financial upside for you. B, how do you verify that that work was done? And then what's the value of that to the network?
Right. Yeah. Those are all of the things that, again, I think the gap between, I shouldn't say the gap between the work, the building of the network really comes with, okay, these tasks is discovery and underwriting and offtake and management, like and financing, like those tasks can now be decentralized, which means they can be scaled using technology, which means it can scale faster and it can scale broader and it can scale ideally lower cost than the amount of time and miscommunication that happens in a centralized situation. I mean, you see this manifest itself, right? Like we've seen this for the last at least like 13 years, like that we've been working on it. You kind of see companies would pop up and be like, okay, we're a solar company. It's like, well, are you a solar company because you think that there's like that's, the solar company is like, the solar is the silver bullet for the power grid? Or are you a solar company because when you went to pitch the people for your money, they said, you're doing too many things. Why don't you just focus on one thing?
Right.
And was that a good idea?
We experienced that ourselves too. Just sort of
right.
Here's what we want to do. But then the Venn diagram has that circle has to intersect with what are the things investors are willing to fund.
Right.
And that has to intersect with what things we're capable of doing today with our skills and personnel. And it's we won't make this into a side rant about
I feel like innovation comes from the constraints, right? It's like if you're constrained and if you had infinite dollars, we'd do some pretty weird stuff, make some. But you're right. It's like you kind of have, I mean, this just gets into the same, I'm sure we could expand this concept of like, what does it take to actually build physical infrastructure? But we could expand that into what does it take to start any project, even if it's a software project. It's like you still have to like discover the gap in the market. You have to underwrite it in some way through research or through validation in some way. Then you have to go figure out like who's going to actually buy this innovation when I like de-risk the market in some way. I mean, you could argue that let's just focus on the electricity grid, given how much shouting and how much demand there is for like a carbon-free, more resilient, like there's so much demand for that amongst people and companies. And you could argue that the companies themselves and the people in the companies, I really do believe want that, but the company itself doesn't need that except for the fact that their customers want it and they'll stop buying from that company unless the company, helps to build a renewable.
I think we've also learned from experience that there's a difference between people shouting for something and people being willing to pay for that something at the level that would support the company doing it. I mean, if people want, totally sustainable green power, but they're only willing to pay, 1 cent more on their bill for it, that's not really a business for.
Right. And that's really sometimes the trouble, right? Is that what gets the money that's already there? What gets like, let's say some company says, I'm a solar company, so I put together $1 billion or $2 or $3 billion worth of solar money. It's money earmarked for solar. So now I got my solar dollar bills here. I can only spend them on solar. So you're going around and you find a piece of land. You're like, wow, That's a huge piece of land. I could put like $1.5 billion worth of solar on that. And then you say, okay, we got to underwrite it, which means I got to find a buyer who's willing to buy it. I got to go through permitting. I got to connect it to the grid somehow because I don't have anybody who's going to use all of that right on site. And so let's say you go all the way down. You're going to already have your financing committed for solar. So as long as you underwrite it and it can return you money, then you build it. So you build this massive solar farm, like out somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And you connect it back to civilization. And then the rest of the grid sort of has to figure out what to do at night because you didn't build any battery backup and you didn't put anybody near that. So now you just have the same old centralized problem you had before, which is you got this centralized entity that is buying massive amounts of solar and then sort of figuring out what to do with it. And now
they're centralized. So they're just saying what your power is worth.
Right. Yeah.
For you.
Yeah. So there you go. So now you're just sort of recreating the problem with a new technology, but it's like, that wasn't the point.
Right.
I hate to use too much of an analogy, but it was sort of like when Facebook tried to create its own crypto token and people are like, nah, good. It's just like, we don't, the whole ethos.
It's not credible.
Yeah. The whole ethos of this is not to go get some massive centralized entity to give you the thing that you want. The whole point is like, well, it's better if it's decentralized. It's more resilient. It's more reliable over time. It's going to scale better. It'll have more utility, like just more use in the world if it's not sort of owned by somebody who is maybe aligned with you, but also maybe not aligned with you.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like how you build on these platforms, whether they're Facebook's Libra or their cryptocurrency or whatever, and the deal is that they've spent all this money building this product and making it nice for you, but do you know that your interest is going to be in line 5 years down the line or even 1 year down the line? And so you've got to have a lot of trust that they are. It's not that different than the electric utility. You put in your $1.5 billion of solar, and basically your financial features in the utility's hands because they decide how much they're going to pay for the power that comes off of those panels, and it's centralized that you have no say. You either agree to their deal or you build somewhere else.
Right. Yeah. So like that whole idea has been tried. It's almost like we had like Power 1.0, which was like, here, everyone take whatever we give to you. And in some ways that's right, because Power 1.0 was like, you need lamps? We got you stuff to power some lamps. And then people are like, oh, you know what? Could really use a refrigerator. Like, okay. We think those are kind of like lamps. We'll do that too. Does everybody want one? Yeah, probably everybody wants one. Oh, we want a TV. Okay. Does everybody want one? Yeah, probably everybody wants one. And so then you go down this line where everybody wants one. Everybody wants one. And then we get to this, we'll call it 2.0, Power 2.0, which is like, users, the buyers, the people who were just like sitting here taking power from me. It was a one-way street forever. We'll let you put a little bit of power back on the grid. You want some solar panels on your roof? We'll let you put a little bit of that on the grid. So they call that 2.0. They send a little user-generated content, let's call it, back into the grid. And now
we're going to control how much of that happens by basically making that solar nearly worthless.
Useless. Only what you need can you put up. And so now we're in that. So that's Power 2.0. Funny how this sort of tracks with like Web 1, Web 2. Right. It was like Web 1 was like, unilateral. It was like, I send to you what I would like to send to you. Web 2 is like, oh, you can send some back into the network. But then these centralized platforms sort of gate how much you can because they'll charge you for sending too much content into the network. And I think the same thing happened with power. It's like you send a little bit back in the network. And now we're at this precipice of like, I'll call it like Power 3.0, which is where like you're seeing this a little. It's not to say you're not cooperating with the central groups in Power 3.0. It's not like you're not cooperating with the utilities, but there are some utility districts that are like kind of cool with the idea of you having like a little community that's powered on your own. And that takes vision from the developers, the actual people who put it up. And that's what's so fascinating to me is we've sort of gone all the way out to the edges where the creators, so to speak, the creators of this new network really are these builders at the end of the line, and hopefully we'll be able to have some of those builders to talk to them on the podcast. But
something magical happens when battery technology is good enough that you can now sort of have not separate grids, but grids that are almost self-sufficient and might need power from the central grid from time to time. But the smarts live at the edge, and that only works if the central utility is not setting the value of that power.
Yeah. And I have to wade us into this dangerous place. And this will be where it's the last thing we'll talk about. This went way longer. I was like, oh, we'll have this conversation today. It'll be over in about 20 minutes. I don't know how long it's actually been, but I was like, well, I have 3 agenda items and this will take 20 minutes. It's like,
okay. 125.
Okay. So this idea of decentralized power, we'll call it Power 3.0 power. I mean, in some ways it's like we need this to be the next movement because there's so many new applications. We were talking about lamps and refrigerators and TVs and just basic stuff that probably everybody's going to want. But now we're in a world where like everybody doesn't want everything that's being put on the grid. So everybody doesn't want right now an electric vehicle. Everybody doesn't want Bitcoin mining. Everybody doesn't want any kind of on-site computing in their home. So how do you design a network or whatever that is, whatever that entity is, and that was our hypothesis is like, there should be an entity that supports this movement. And that was the spirit of starting Aston Labs is like, how do you support this decentralized web, which is becoming like our economy? I mean, it's feeding into every single facet of our economy and everyone's exposed to it, even if they feel like they're not. Like you can't sit outside of this and be like, nah, I'm not really interested in participating. It's like, if you're in any way connected to the economy, which pretty much everybody is, it's like, if you sit outside of it, there's a chance that everything you've trusted and all these centralized groups you've trusted can be wiped out by this movement. And so like, what are you going to have? Like, this has always been the argument of the centralized grid is like, who's going to bear the cost of the centralized grid if people start leaving the grid?
People leave the grid to do their own thing that's beneficial to them, it sort of leaves behind everybody who's stuck on the centralized grid, and their power becomes more expensive, less reliable, because the utility can't, there's a shared cost that we're all paying to be part of the current world. And as people leave to do their own thing, the commons become crappier and crappier for everybody who's still on it.
Right. So that goes back to this idea of like, decentralized doesn't necessarily mean that the central grid goes away. An optimized build of a decentralized grid is that you still rely on that. A lot of that infrastructure was there, but as you said, the decisions go out to the end. The decision making about like what the main power we're going to use. The main power we're going to use is in our neighborhoods and at the end of the network. The backup power is the middle of the network. And so the question is like, well, how valuable is that backup for you? And how long does that need to last? So the thing I said we were going to wade ourselves into maybe is kind of a dangerous place to go, but we are bold and we're going there, is decentralized is one thing. Carbon free is another thing. So someone asked me the other day, they said, well, so carbon free because like you need to save the planet. And I was like, well, it seems like a little Messiah complexy kind of thing. So I was like, yeah, getting rid of carbon emissions for making electricity or whatever we're doing, basic needs ideally would not emit any carbon or can't be emitting carbon. So from your perspective, why should this new decentralized network also be carbon free?
I think there's a few ways to answer that. I think one way is that one framing of it is that, out here in the West Coast, we just lived through yet another bad wildfire season, and Lake Powell is an all-time low. We've got last winter there were fire tornadoes in Colorado. It's like the climate change was sort of this vague, distant thing that, I remember as a kid, I read once about climate change, and I think it was still, I forget what they called it back then, but I was reading this article about the rise of the oceans, and it was scary to me as a kid, but also it was supposed to happen in 2050, and I was like, oh, I'll be old by then. But now we're seeing it's sort of this, it's happening now, and if we're gonna rethink how if we're gonna go through all the effort of rethinking how the system works, we might as well go all the way and rethink it for the future, because are we really gonna redesign it now and then redesign it again in 10 years or 20 years? Or there's a this is a software engineer. There are tons of examples all around us of systems that somebody built that it was good enough for that moment, and here we are 50 years later, and we're still dealing with limitations of that system because it sucks, but it mostly works. It's fine. And so it's sort of this moment of, if the stakes are as high as they appear to be, we should do the right thing versus the just good enough thing, because we're probably not going to have another chance to redesign the system in our lifetimes.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say, I don't have to worry about 2050 because I'll be immortal by then. Technology will make me immortal by then, so I won't have to worry about it.
Depending on the track we're on, immortality might be a curse by that point.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's true. I suppose, also like the urgency to get things done. Probably if you really truly believed you were going to be immortal, you'd just be like, it's all good. I'll just hang out.
I'm good. I'll be at the beach.
Yeah, that's interesting. My take on carbon free is, of course, all of those things. I think there's like the existential reason and just enduring. Like, again, like 50 years from now, do you want to have to both replace the technology that has now sort of broken down because it just ages and it needs to be replaced, but do you also want to have to like re-architect the whole thing? Like, basically, do we want to have to like rebuild the house from scratch, or do you just want to add a coat of paint? It's like, it's better to build something so that you could just continuously add a coat of paint rather than have to like rip the whole entire house out of the ground because you built it out of crap. And
nobody ever redesigned or does the big hard redesign unless things are so bad that they're forced to. And so if we're at a point now where we can redesign the system, we might as well redesign it for the thing we know is coming, because we might wind up in that in-between place where we design a system that's not actually good enough to tackle the problems, but is just good enough that no one's going to bother fixing it.
Yeah. I think from this is way too optimistic of a view, but you know me well enough that that's where I'm going to land most of the time. So the optimistic view that I have is just like, well, everything that's carbon free is a technology. It's like, it's a PlayStation. You know what I mean? It's like the PlayStation comes out, you don't want to buy it now because it's gonna be like half price next year. You know, like I want to go, or like the parts are going to be better. Like it's going to be more efficient. There's something that's going to happen to technology that's going to improve over time. So if you are like an expert in the energy business, you've been in it for a long time, you look at it and you're like, well, those pieces of technology are no good because their useful life is only 25 years and my gas plant will last for 70. And it's like, well, which by the way, I don't even know if those numbers are actually right. My point is just like, this will last a really long time. Just have to keep feeding it fuel. And then what we've seen from technology over our lifetimes is just like, well, I'd rather bet on technology over the long term getting better than I would bet on like a fuel getting better. Like I just don't like natural gas isn't necessarily going to just magically get better than it is today. Maybe it gets slightly more efficient. Maybe it emits slightly less carbon, or figure out how to capture the carbon, and all of those things are great. But now we're moving towards this carbon free thing. It's like, yes, you can take the stuff that emits carbon and then you can make it carbon free, but you still have to feed it every day. Like that costs money every single day that you have to do. Like the amount of inputs that you need to put into the system, they cost money and they cost other fuels. So like to extract fuel and then move fuel and then get it to where it needs to go and then burn the fuel and then emit the carbon. So I guess for me, the optimistic view is like, well, it's technology. I'll never short technology. I'll never sit here and say, well, those batteries won't work. They have cobalt in them. It's like, okay, you don't think somebody will change? You don't think if that's a scarce resource, technology is always going to find a way to eliminate the scarce resource. It's just, you have to, because if you that's just how it works.
Yeah. I feel like I'm optimistic on the tech and pessimistic on the, I guess, business side, in the sense that the tech can do it, but are the people who are writing the checks going to want to do it?
Right. Well, I think we've already seen that. Like the answer is no. The people who are writing the checks today it's so much more convenient for like somebody who owns a whole bunch of gas power plants to say, well, if you shut those down, your power lights are going to, what did I just say? If you shut those down, your lights are going to go off. And it's like, well, that's scary. I don't want you to do that. It's much harder to say like, well, you don't know if that person's technology over there is going to work. And so therefore you should be afraid of it and we shouldn't change anything. And I think that's where we've landed in this dichotomy of the people who have the stuff up, keeping the lights on, can just say, if we move that stick that's holding up the grid, like what's going to happen? You don't know. I don't know. So we should all just be afraid of it and not move the stick, because I'm making a lot of money off of that stick.
Fear, uncertainty, and doubt are powerful forces.
Yeah, exactly. The FUDs. Oh man. Hey, this was awesome. We're probably gonna do this again sometime. I mean, we're probably gonna talk after this. All right. Thanks for joining me today on this.
Look forward to the next episode.
I know I've probably inspired you to continue showing up on this over and over and over.
I mean, I'll sleep on it.
See. All right, man.
All right.
See ya.
See ya.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the World Changing Podcast. Be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, to hear the latest episodes.